for Tenure Part 1. This is the last webinar in the early 2023 RWSN webinar series. My name is Kerstin Dannett. I work for Ask for Water, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's webinar. Now, water supply projects, they often overlook or misunderstand mobile pastoralists' water needs and management practices. And this webinar will shed some light on pastoralists, water tenure, rights and governance, with particular attention to the issues of women and people who are being left behind. And we're hoping that this will continue to build momentum and fill knowledge gaps in the lead up to 2026, which is the United Nations International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. So we're going to have 3 quite short presentations, and then we're going to open up to a panel discussion and really have questions and answers and a discussion exchange with you. And that's a chance for you to pose your questions and for the group to discuss. We'll then close the webinar. We'll finish at about 4 o'clock Swiss time, which is just 1 hour and 40 minutes from 1 hour 20 minutes from now. So with the next slide, I'd like to just show you our chief organizer for this webinar, Barbara van Koppen, myself, and our speakers for today. And I'm going to introduce them each as they come up to speak. Unfortunately, Michael is not able to be with us today. There was a last minute change, but he sends his greetings and he's with us in spirit. So now we're going to go to hear the presentation from Sofia. Let me just introduce Sofia Espinosa Flor. Sofia is a land and water tenure specialist with a PhD in socioeconomics, and her work has focused on analysing the social and cultural factors that influence land and water transactions, tenure rights, legal pluralism, and rights that are associated with land and water tenure. Recently, she's been focusing on mainstreaming tenure in the water sector, including assessments in Senegal, Sri Lanka, and Rwanda. And she's currently supporting the Global Water Tenure Dialogue, led by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and its partners.
Thank you so much for the organizers and for all the people joining us today. For me, it's really a pleasure to share with you an amazing and innovative initiative FAO is supporting with all of his partners, and is around a global dialogue on water tenure for food security, climate resilience, and social inclusion. So what is this global dialogue and why it is important? Next slide, please. Sorry, no, that's not the last version. I'm so sorry. Don't worry, let's make it work with that. So please, second slide. So what is water tenure governance important? So as you know, approximately 10% of the global population live in areas facing high and crucial water stress. And as we look ahead to 2050, it is estimated that global demand for water will substantially increase for 30%. This makes the issue of allocation of water all the more crucial. So understanding water tenure as the relationship, whatever legally or customarily defined between people as individuals or groups, can help us understand how customary tenure is also important. This can help us better understand how people access and use water in practice, and to ensure water access for all users, particularly in rural areas, and support food security and livelihoods, increase security and encourage investment in water infrastructure, increase resilience to climate change, and finally, this can allow us to avoid, prevent, and address potential and existing water conflicts. Because as you know, many people in rural areas rely on customary and informal water arrangements, and they may have very little water security. Next slide, please. So how did we get to this, let's say, idea of a global dialogue around water tenure? Let's see, this started for the negotiation of the voluntary guidelines for responsible governance of tenure of land, forest, and fisheries, known in English as the BGGPs. For our Francophone colleagues, these are les DV, or les Directives Volontaires, which has been an important instrument to improve equitable access to land resources, particularly for vulnerable and marginalized populations. This has been a really big step for the international community and for all the indigenous populations to have an instrument to protect their rights. Unfortunately, water was not included in this text, but FAO and its partners, based on these principles, and still convinced that these principles can also ensure access to all users, FAO continue working on water and water tenure, exploring this concept and building knowledge around this. This is how in 2019, a group of experts come together to think about how to enforce this, and came with the definition I give you in my first slide. For FAO, one of the main also milestones around water tenure was the launching of the project Knowing Water Better, that allow us to generate knowledge, build capacities, and network around water tenure. Understanding water tenure not only, as I explained before, not only as the legal part of water, but also as all the customary arrangements around that. With all this work, last year, FAO got the mandate from the Committee on Agriculture to start a global dialogue on water tenure in collaboration with other UN partners, and to start exploring principles around responsible governance of water tenure. Finally, this year, we launched this dialogue on March during the UN Conference of Water. Next slide, please. So what is the idea around this global dialogue on water tenure? The first expert meeting that was held in Rome last year, we agreed that this principle will have to be, of course, a multi-stakeholder dialogue, including government, civil society, pastoral communities, indigenous peoples groups, and others. It will have to build and to have the objective to have a non-binding principles, and to also build on criteria for implementation, action and monitoring. The overarching goal of this global consultative process is to develop a set of global principles for responsible governance of water tenure that can support countries and their institutions to improve governance of water as a means of realizing food security, social inclusion, and foresting climate change resilience. And of course, these in the framework of realizing the SDGs. Next slide, please. How is FAO going to support this process, and how we invite you all to engage? Please note that we want this to be a bottom-up approach. So we invite you all to also contribute to the efforts on building knowledge, capacities, and network around water tenure. This can, and it will feed the process that is going to aim for national dialogues that then are going to feed regional consultations and finally inform the global dialogue on water tenure. We invite you to build synergies with other ongoing initiatives. For the moment, I'm just going to mention Colombia and Thailand, where FAO is going to pilot these national consultations. We invite you, as we are here, to involve in the experts group on water tenure. I know all the panelists you're going to hear today, they are already part of this, but if you are interested, please try to reach us. and to find strategic linkages with other global policy processes, such as the Global Action Agenda, all the activities around the voluntary guidelines or the Rome-Wire dialogue. And hopefully we like to invite you to event that is still not confirmed, but we hopefully will have a side event on October this year. Next slide, please. And with that, I thank you so much. Please note this is going to be a long process and we need the support of all actors. Thank you so much for your attention, and please don't hesitate to contact us and to visit our website. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Sophia, for your presentation and really for helping us to understand more what water tenure is, and that it's about legal and customary relationships. Yeah, it's fascinating, and well done at bringing water into tenure on land, forestry and fisheries. For those within the water sector, it's obvious, but it's a great job in bringing that in. There's already some people here who we've got a podcast request here, and I'm sure there's plenty of questions are going to come in to help to understand how this really great dialogue process is going to happen. So if you have questions, please, I see some hands up. If you can pop your questions into the Q&A. So down at the bottom, there's a button for questions, Q&A, questions and answers. Please, Arthur, and I see another hand raised. If you can put your questions in there, that's great. And then we can move on with the other two presentations and really get to your questions. So that brings me to our second presentation, which I'm really looking forward to. We're going to try to do the recording, and if not, Hella, you'll be live. But let me just tell you who Hella Gazmi is. So Hella is currently undertaking her PhD through a joint doctorate program at the Federal University of Fortaleza, Sierra, and the Agricultural University in Montpellier. She already holds a master's degree in sustainable management of water resources, and her PhD, which is really interesting, involves developing a participatory approach to identify and analyse water resilience with local communities at different scales, and to co-design rural water supply and sanitation projects to improve community water resilience. And Hella really combines empirical knowledge of rural water supply and multiple water uses and community water management to understand resilience in rural semi-arid regions. So let's see if we can hear the recording, Daniela, and if not, we'll go to you live, Hella. But this is going to be a really great presentation as well.
Yeah. So hello, everyone. I'm Hella Gazmi, as Kirsten has represented me. I'm very glad to be here with you to participate in this exciting webinar on water tenure. So as she said, I'm a PhD student. I'm working on water resilience in rural communities in Brazil and Tunisia. And this webinar, it's all about collaboration and learning from each other. So please feel free to ask me questions or to share your thoughts in the chat. And thanks again for being here, and I'll get started with my presentation. So I will present case studies from my PhD research. Today it will be about Central of Tunisia. These communities all have problematic access to water, and they belong to the governorate of Sidi Bouzid, which is also known as the starting point of the 2011 Arab Spring. So they were marginalized for so long by the state. However, the population was strongly activated in political life, as well in the manifestation for their right to access water for their multiple uses, for drinking, cooking, as well for irrigation and livestock. So today, the relation between these two communities and the state is basically about providing financial and technical support for the water supply system of these two communities. And in these communities, the landscape is very dominated by rain-fed olive and almond But there is still irrigation, which is very limited to rich people who have private boreholes and wells, because the irrigation is forbidden in these two communities. So please, the next slide. Thank you. So in these two communities, some households are connected directly to the water supply network and do store water in cisterns for domestic uses, for vegetable gardens, irrigation, and for livestock watering. And most households have rainwater collection tanks for drinking, cooking, which can be always also separate for the communities which are not connected to the network. So they need to build two cisterns, one for rainwater harvesting, which is only for drinking and cooking, and the other cistern will be to store water from tank trucks, which has purchased from private wells, which can be for all the uses, for irrigation, watering, cattle watering, and for domestic uses. And as I said, the wealthy households have private wells for irrigation, and they can use it for domestic uses if necessary. So in these two communities, the water supply system are designed for drinking, cooking, which also we can call it domestic uses, but these communities adapted the water supply networks to ensure sustainable access for their multiple uses, including irrigation and watering cattle. So managing multiple sources for multiple uses through multiple infrastructure in these cases is the obvious way, and the single purpose is still the exceptions. However, the projects do design this water supply networks only for domestic uses. And here we ask the question about the multiple uses and their necessary use in this context, where the communities need all the multiple uses to survive this drought and their daily life. So we have here a very exceptional context, because after the revolution of 2011, the number of illegal connections have increased. So can you pass to the next slide, please? Yeah. So in one community, they have 180 families which are connected, but 30 families still not connected. And the other system or supply network, 300 are connected and 300 families are still waiting to join the network. So the individual connection, which is illicit here, resulted in reduced water flow, pumping failures, and every time the rural water supply system was upgraded, new households would be included, especially who were already created illicit connection on their own. But here, the irrigation from private wells and boreholes is forbidden in this area because of the groundwater overdraft, but the number of the serious wells and boreholes is constantly increasing, given that it's an individual alternative to survive in this context. And in central Tunisia, in general, the droughts have been there since 2015, so people cannot survive without their individual strategy. Next slide, please. So here is an example about the water tenure, which we can see more in this context of drought. So the isolated houses, which are the communities who lack water because of the others who are closer to the head of the water network and use it for irrigation. So people who are in the the upstream of the network cannot have access to water, and to survive, they do mobilize the water tenor, which is in this case based on 3 systems. They use it for all for all the uses. And after 1 year of drought, the main system has been closed by its owner, and he's the only one who can use it for irrigation and for cattle watering. Even the water tenor has limits when it's a difficult context. So the next slide, please. Yeah, it's the final one. So once again, thank you for being here and for being a part of this webinar. I look forward to addressing your question in the Q&A, and thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much, Hella, for taking us to Tunisia, taking us to these communities, and really, yeah, communities who are been marginalized for long, but they're very active. You know, we can see that, and really helping us to understand the importance of these individual strategies for their survival and thinking about what that means for rural development. So thank you very much, Hella, for your presentation. Please, if you have questions, either for Sophia or for Hella, please put them in the chat box. There's lots of broad questions, but it would be really great to, since we have Hella and Sophia today with us, to really focus on what we're hearing from them and what that means for you in your particular projects and countries. So we're going to move towards our third and final presenter, Tafadzwa Mabawadi, and he's a senior researcher and research group leader in sustainable and resilient food systems at the International Water Management Institute, IMI. He's also a research associate professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And Tafadzwa has more than 10 years of experience in conducting research and translating that research into policy outcomes. He's published more than 200 papers, that's a lot, and has received several awards. So we're really honored to have you with us today.
Good day. My name is Tafadzwa Mabawadi. I lead IMI's research group on sustainable and resilient food systems. And I'll be talking to you today about farmer-led irrigation development in a changing climate and looking at how do we move from global to plot scale and across multiple scales. Just in terms of context, we expect that under climate change, given the most recent projections, about 11% of croplands are vulnerable to climate change, and about 20% yield reduction is expected under RCP 4.5. And we know that with these increased losses, they will mostly affect smallholder farmers in the global south who do not have the capacity to respond to climate change. And they also lack access to water and energy for irrigation, as well as other uses at the homestead level. So how do we start moving across the different scales to address this challenge at a plot or at a farm level? Now, just to give an understanding of context when we talk about multiple scales and moving across scales, we are talking about moving, in this case, you can move either from global and you are zooming in to the crop, or you are moving from the crop level and moving to the regional level and the global level. It is important to understand the role and importance of water across these different scales and how to manage it, as there are significant implications in terms of system level trade-offs. For example, a lot of improvements in water use efficiency that happen at the field, farm, and community level are usually not transferred to the catchment and basin level because the water is often reallocated at farm or field level to other uses. Hence, we need to understand the trade-offs and how water can be managed across these different levels. And in the context of the work we are doing at IMI, where we have been focusing on the water, energy, food nexus, it also becomes important to understand the different actors who have also different objectives and agendas, as well as how to incentivize those different actors across these different scales. So when we talk about multiple use services, and we talk about WASH, and we talk about water, energy, and food, and livelihoods, it is important to understand who those actors at different scales are and how you then bring them together to bring about change in behaviors. In this particular talk, we are going to look in particular at the farm community, where we also have interest in integrating pastoral communities who are often not considered when we talk about agricultural water management. Now, moving forward now at the community level, we have three common pathways in terms of water management that we have. The dominant one is the rain-fed system, which in Africa accounts for about 95% of agricultural production. We also have at this level public irrigation schemes, which were developed. Most of them were developed in the colonial era. There are some that have been developed post-colonial era, but most of them struggle in terms of performance and delivering on the objectives for which they were actually set out for. Of particular interest to this talk is farmer-led irrigation development, which is something that has emerged over time and mostly driven by farmers who are transitioning out of rain-fed cropping, de-risking from rain-fed systems, and moving into this new space. And just to zoom in more on farmer-led irrigation, this is generally where farmers themselves are driving the improvement in their water use. They are driving the investments in pumps, in irrigation, in sustainable irrigation technologies, and they are initiating the demand. Hence, we call it farmer-led irrigation development. So it is very organic, it is very bottom-up, but it also requires a lot of support, because it is not just about water, it is about several other things coming together. And this is where we start talking about the issue of bundling technologies, where we need to bring in inputs, because with access to water, you also need to be planting the right varieties that have the right water productivity and can yield the maximum under the irrigation. We need to also improve the agronomic practices so that you can optimize the production and productivity. We need to think about the value chain in terms of processing, distribution, post-harvest handling and storage, and how we market and provide access to markets to farmers. So we have been working a lot in the realm of bundled innovations, bringing these different interventions into single packages that support farmers at the farm and smallholder community level. Now, we also need to understand that fleet or farmer-led irrigation development plays out in the context of multiple use services. Hence, it has several and multiple drivers that are driving it and increasing the demand. A lot of this is farmers wanting to de-risk and move out of rain-fed systems so that they can improve productivity and income from producing high-level crops, as well as get stabler yields under increasing rainfall variability. And what we are seeing is that in a lot of cases, the limitations were usually around the investments in pump technology and energy. And this is where solar irrigation or solar-based irrigation has really played a significant role in terms of reducing the energy costs, and also the bundling of innovations and some of the models that have been used, such as pay as you go, have also helped to make solar-based irrigation affordable to farmers. In some cases, you have business models where you've got one farmer who invests in the solar pump and then irrigates for others. There is a significant overlap between farmer-led irrigation development and water for sanitation and hygiene or self-supply, and the use of multiple use services, because at the community and farm level, water infrastructure is often used for multiple purposes. So if you've got a pump, it's not only used to irrigate water, it's also used to pump water for the household. It's used to pump water for the livestock, especially during the dry periods. It is also used for several other purposes that support the broader household activities as well as the broader community activities. So wash and feed do go hand in hand. And what we have found is that through promoting feed, we are indirectly also promoting access to water and enhanced wash. Now, what we have also learned is that there is a need for multi-hectare partnerships for scaling this solar-based fleet so that it reaches more people. We need to work with a different range of actors, not just researchers, but we also need to reach out to private and public sector partners and come up with these innovative bundles that bring together the different solutions and bring them closer to farmers, and also make them affordable to farmers and accessible to farmers. And this is where it becomes important, especially at the farm and community level, in terms of how do we support investments in multi-purpose infrastructure, how do we support investments in feed, and how do we support these investments to translate into tangible outcomes for rural communities in terms of addressing issues of income, poverty, food security, and wash at the farm and community level. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Good day.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tafadzwa, for your really rich presentation. There's so much in there, you know, from taking us through the different scales, this whole issue of bundling, and I think we'll come back to that with the questions, and your real focus on tangible output. So, no, thanks a lot. I can see why you've won many awards, because there's a huge amount of knowledge there. So before we open up for discussion, and we have a number of questions coming in, I'd like to just hand over to our first discussant, Jessica Troll. Jessica Troll has over 20 years of experience in international development and environmental law, with a focus on inclusive, equitable, and effective legal policy and institutional tools. And her focus is on sustainable freshwater resources management, but really from a legal perspective. She's very well recognised for her work on international, comparative and transboundary water law and governance, as well as water tenure, community-based natural resource governance, climate resilience laws and policies, and public participation. Jessica is based in Harare, Zimbabwe, where she directs the Environmental Law Institute's International Water Programme. So let's just hear some words from you, Jessica, before we open up to the wider group for the questions that are coming in. So Jessica, you're live anyway, so no more recording issues.
Totally live, yes. Thank you so much for having me here and allowing me to follow on these really rich and diverse set of examples that the presenters are bringing to bear, and really highlighting the ways in which customary and community-based water tenure links so many different aspects of WASH, water resource management. And I'll really focus in on the need for better, clearer recognition of communities' rights to ensure that they're able to meet those multiple needs for domestic livelihoods, food securities, and climate resilience, among others. So just to take a step back, in terms of, focusing on what we're looking at today, which is customary, or I would actually broaden that to say we're really looking at community-based water tenure, including customary systems of water tenure. But I think it's broader than only just customary systems. And look at the scale and importance of that issue, because we've seen examples from Africa, from North Africa, from, sort of globally. I think this resonates with everyone. And that's because approximately half of the world's land is stewarded by 2.5 billion indigenous peoples and local communities. And the community-based tenure systems that they employ regulate the access to and use of natural resources, including water, on at least half of the world's land mass. And in sub-Saharan Africa, where I live and work, it's over 60% of the land. Yet only about 10% of this land is legally vested with those communities. And this significantly constrains their ability to pursue locally adapted livelihoods and protect the vital water resources and other resources contained in their territories. So I am focused on the legal recognition and protection of community-based, including, again, customary water tenure rights, as sort of a critical basis, not the only basis, not the, I recognize that implementation and enforcement of those legal recognitions is a whole other kettle of fish, which we need to work on, but that it's a primary and necessary basis for ensuring that communities can realize their human right to water and meet the WASH-related SDGs, but also, again, to achieve food security, climate resilience, sustainable livelihoods, and a host of other development goals. So I wanted to focus just a little bit on, Sophia defined water tenure for us. And I wanted to kind of take that a step further and just talk about the fact that it really, it's not just also about the relationships between people and communities with respect to their water resources, but also about sort of a range or bundle of rights that include not just water use and access, but also where communities are concerned, it involves their management or governance rights over decision-making for allocation, use, and development of water, both for WASH and for resource management. So I think this is really critical because it brings us back around to some of the key issues and barriers that the speakers were really identifying with how to make more sustainable choices when developing farmer-led irrigation, multiple use services, et cetera. And importantly, this incorporates procedural rights that are really critical to ensuring that communities, and particularly women in communities, needs and priorities are represented in decision-making. Tafadswa really highlighted the critical importance of addressing all of these issues at multiple levels and ensuring that these innovations and the adaptive approaches that we're seeing at the community level, at having those reflected and incorporated at the basin or catchment level, and I would say even at the national level. And we can see how community-based water tenure arrangements that include meaningful procedural rights, and by those I mean access to information about potential developments or decisions that could impact water rights, rights to participate in and influence those decisions and developments, and then the rights to access remedies if water tenure rights are infringed or extinguished. And that these are really critical to achieving this kind of multi-level effective nested governance, as are better protections for secure tenure rights that should emanate from these innovative developments that the communities are undertaking all the time. Without meaningful opportunities to be represented in all of their diversity in decision-making around planning, allocation, and management, I think we all probably have had experience with how we can falter in our decision-making, and investments, particularly in infrastructure, fail over time, and communities' water needs are overlooked or ignored. We actually, IMI and my organization, the Environmental Law Institute, in partnership with the University of Zimbabwe, just did some research on multiple use services, looking at the key challenges and innovations into Zimbabwean landscapes. And we saw some incredible efforts on behalf of the NGOs and donors who are supporting these processes for planning and community visioning, but there's still real challenges in terms of sustainability over time, in terms of partnerships with local government, in terms of ongoing competition and conflicts that really continue to arise from this persistent division that we see across countries, legally, institutionally, financially, dividing water service provision for domestic uses from water resource planning for allocation and use and management, again, from irrigation, water resource planning and management. And this siloing is really impacting the ability of communities to sustainably access, use, and manage their waters in effective ways that's reflective of their own tenure systems. And we noticed in particular that at the community level, you know, as much as we know better at this point, allocation for domestic uses is often not effectively accounted for because consultation with women hasn't really been undertaken in a way that's enabled them to really have a voice in decision making. And so men prioritize investments in irrigation without sufficient consideration of these wash needs. And we get, again, conflicts or even silent conflicts where women, until they're asked, don't even say anything about it. But there's a real need, a pressing need for more robust and tailored stakeholder and community consultation requirements. And I think that's not just a Zimbabwean issue. I think that's a real issue across many countries. And in particular, more explicit recognition of women's water tenure rights. I don't want to take too much of everyone's time, but I did want to highlight just a couple more themes that I see emerging, not just from the presentations today, but also from the work that ELI, my organization, and IMI and FAO and others have been doing to sort of assess water tenure at the community level and see how it's being legally recognized and protected. And the first of these is sort of intuitive, but it has a lot of really important implications, and that's the ways in which communities' freshwater tenure rights are so dependent on their legally recognized land or forest rights. In a study of 15 countries across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, we found that these land water or forest water nexuses, we called them, were in over 60% of the community-based water regimes. And in some countries, it's the only way that communities have water tenure rights. We also found that water tenure arrangements that have a land water nexus that are dependent on land rights or forest rights also often provide communities with a much wider range of rights. For example, when you get into territorial rights of indigenous peoples, that often includes a right to fresh water within those territories, but you don't see that recognized often in just the water laws. And this is particularly true for community women, whose rights are rarely explicitly recognized in water laws. And these nexuses between land and water can come from so many different places. They can come from land, forest, constitutional laws, et cetera, but they're not speaking to each other effectively. And so you often have agricultural laws that are implicitly impacting communities' water tenure rights, while the water law doesn't say anything at all about it. And so these contradictions and this lack of clarity across sectoral laws leave communities vulnerable to legal challenges when other third parties come in to claim water use rights. And in pastoral communities in particular, I know we were going to highlight this a little bit, there's also frequently a need to explicitly unlink water tenure from land rights and recognize the territorial nature of their pastoral roots. And for example, in Mali, the pastoral code prioritizes pastoral community rights to their water points along their traditional areas, regardless of their land or forest rights. And this kind of prioritization, and I know Barbara Van Hoppen will probably mention this as well, this kind of legal prioritization of customary and community-based water tenure rights can be a really powerful tool for ensuring that communities have effective legal standing, particularly where their rights are maybe exempted from permitting or licensing requirements. And so we see across most countries, you know, communities will have a certain level of usually domestic or wash rights, don't require a permit. They don't require any payment, but that comes without a legal recognition or an allocation of a specific amount of water. And so not only does that leave them vulnerable again to challenges, but we've also seen that it's very restrictive, and that in that same 15 country study, we found that livelihoods uses are half of the time do require a permit. And this can be really challenging for communities. So if we're only focusing on exempting wash use rights or domestic use rights to the neglect of livelihoods and food security, we're really overlooking kind of the holistic nature of communities' water needs, uses, and rights. And we really need to rethink sort of our administrative allocation and tools that we're using to do that, and prioritize maybe permitting the large scale users and recognizing in different ways communities' water tenure rights more clearly. I guess finally, I would just say, hearing all of these incredible examples of farmer-led irrigation development, community-led multiple use services, that these, I think we should recognize as living customary law. These are, you know, we think about customary laws sort of, you know, since time immemorial, but really it's about communities who are able to adapt over time and really be able to respond to new legal requirements, climate challenges, all of these things. And so, you know, taking these kinds of practices on board and and understanding how to incorporate those types of practices into decision-making and the legal recognition of customary laws, I think is going to be incredibly important over time. And then I guess before I sign off, I really do need to say that the global dialogue represents an incredible opportunity to collaborate across multiple water subsectors. I know we have a lot of WASH folks here, water resource management. We don't often get to talk to each other about the intersections of these issues. And this global dialogue is really an opportunity for us to come together in the interest of ensuring that these principles of responsible governance of water tenure are effective and practical, but that they also elevate the voices of Indigenous and local communities so that their priorities are elevated and that their water tenure is recognized and secure. So thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very, very much, Jessica, for bringing in those legal perspectives. Before we go to Barbara Van Koppen, I'd like to just open up some of the questions. So I have a set of 4 kind of interlinked questions for you, Hella. So one is about the quality of the water from the private well. That was from Andrew Aigner. Is there quality of the private wells? Do you know if people are becoming sick because of the water quality? So that's, my video's off. Thank you. That's question 1. And the other is, are there any recommendations or emerging recommendations about addressing conflicts, reducing fragility and resilience? Maybe it's too early to have those recommendations, but if you have something, it'd be great to hear from you. So over to you, Hella.
Yeah, thank you for these 2 questions. For the first one, for the water quality, people prefer rainwater harvesting for cooking and drinking. So the wells and the boreholes are used for irrigation, and the quality depends on the area where it's drilled. So the principal problem is the salinity, but there is no health problem caused by this drilling. So for the second question, for the recommendation, I think it's not very difficult to solve the problem of the designed water network for one uses. So there is already the multiple uses services, which was created by the IRC. So if we can design water network for multiple uses, which put the people needs at starting point, this is the first recommendation. The second is to have participatory approach, which is engage the communities in the designing phase and not only at the final phase to manage it. So if we can, they can participate at the early stage, it will help in the situation. It's not the only recommendation, but at this stage, I think these 2 points can help.
Well, that's great, Hella. And yeah, it looks like you have an audience for your PhD and your papers when it comes out. So we're all going to be looking forward to hear really what you come out, because we can all learn so much from the incredible work and that you're doing. So I have another question which potentially could be for the whole panel, but I'm actually going to put it to Tafadzwa. It's around improving, so it's a question from Louisa Gosling. Improving water in these contexts needs long-term investment by farmers, which can potentially provide long-term benefits. And so what she's asking is, how are water rights passed on to family members, including women, widows, and daughters? And if you're not comfortable with the question, you can pass it on to somebody else, but I'm sure that you have some insights there. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Barbara is the actual expert in water rights. I'll comment and she can weigh in with the opinion. So customary water rights are in my understanding, are different from the water rights that are linked to private property, which are handed over in terms of inheritance and so forth. In terms of the customary, again, it is linked to land and land tenure, which is also associated with water tenure. There is the challenge, in my understanding, in the gap, the gender dimension and the ability of women and the girl child to inherit land in the customary system. Land is traditionally owned by men and is passed on from one male to another male in the household. So that has always been a challenge in terms of water rights, and I think a lot of work is being done in that space to transform water rights. And Barbara has been, and the team have been working a lot on promoting a new concept of hybrid water laws that seek to recognize customary water tenure and water rights. And hopefully with the institutionalization of those, it would also support greater investments by smallholder farmers into small-scale irrigation. But what we currently see, again, from a farmer-led irrigation development perspective and the scale at which it is done, which is usually at a farm or household level, and the functions that it supports from a multiple use perspective, that the water can be used for gardening, for the vegetable, it can be used for household uses, domestic uses, and so forth, that there is an incentive for farmers at that scale to invest into the smallholder or the farmer-led irrigation development because of the scale, and also because it is mostly happening at their household level at a scale of land that they have, or that they exercise a greater degree of control. I think it becomes a challenge when you try to scale it up to like schemes and so forth. But then schemes are governed quite differently in terms of water user associations. But I see Jessica's got her hand up. I'm sure she wants to shed more light on that.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you so much, Tafadzwa. And I can really see Jessica's there ready to speak. So over to you, Jessica.
Thanks so much. No, Tafadzwa, that was great. I really, everything you said is accurate and rings true. I would just add that the complexity of it really comes from, again, this sort of where the rights are emanating from and how they're recognized, customary rights in particular. And again, this can happen sort of as at the constitutional level, sort of saying broadly customary laws are recognized broadly. So, what that means in practice can vary significantly according to the customs themselves, whether those are linked to specific water bodies and land, et cetera. Usually they are territorial in nature, as you said. I think the key issue that we need to remember, several of the key issues that we need to remember are one that, because they come from such different places, that there are conflicts across laws. And that, for example, and a really good example of this is in Kenya, where in 2016, the same year, they passed the Community Land Act, which broadly recognized community lands as customary rights, having equal legal status to any other land rights, whether the communities were registered or not. That same year, they passed the Water Act. Now, this gets a little complicated, but not too complicated. Under the Constitution, the definition of land includes water on and under the land. So technically, the Community Lands Act grants all of those customary lands holders all of their customary water rights as well. But the Water Act does not. The Water Act says you have to form a water user association, or you have to have a permit to gain most of the water rights that they should have, just having been recognized customarily. So it gets quite complex under an administrative system where, different aspects are speaking to different pieces of it. We've recently done, ELI and IMI actually just published a research paper looking at all of the different legislative pathways for recognizing customary water tenure in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So and that really starts to break down, all the different ways. And it also starts to ask some of the questions around kind of the politics of recognition, really, who is it that should be recognizing customary rights? Does the state have a right to come in and tell communities whether or not their rights are valid? Who has legitimate tenure rights, and how are those defined? So that's a whole other set of questions that I think comes up when you ask these questions. And for women in particular, I won't add much to what Tafadzwa said, other than, it also links to inheritance and marriage laws. And because women own significantly less land and also have significantly less land tenure security than men, they're also suffering, their water tenure also suffers. So it's something that we need to think of holistically and in an integrated manner. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. And I see, Sophia, you've opened your video. So do you want to respond to this as well? I have a question for you, but yeah, comment on this, please.
So maybe just one small and big source of information is that what we have learned working in the land sector and in the forest sector, using the terminology of tenure is, and as it is in the voluntary guidelines, is that we call rights to all the bundle of rights as just mentioned, and we mention all legitimate tenure right holders. So that means that it doesn't need to be necessarily explicitly recognized of a legal framework as long as it is recognized for the other members of a community. So this brings a broader approach, and for indigenous peoples, for example, or pastoral communities, usually their rights are legitimate by their communities, in their communities, and by the surrounding communities. So this brings another set of important questions, and is also the importance of talking about tenure as it is and not rights as we used to call it before, even if those are completely integrated, but it gives us let's say a way of understanding among sectors and among sectors of expertise, but among sectors also, meaning government, private sector, civil society. This is also one of the advantages of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophia. And Barbara, you've put your hand up just at the right time, because I was about to call you in. So that's great. You're clearly ready. But I'd just like to introduce Barbara before you speak. I mean, Barbara, who really pulled all of us together for this webinar today. Dr. Barbara Koppen is a scientist emerita at the International Water Management Institute, based in Southern African office. Her research and policy dialogue focus on the realization of the human rights to water and food through integrated community-led water infrastructure development and customary surface and groundwater sharing. And she's lead author and editor of 5 books and co-author of over 150 peer-reviewed publications. How do you do all of that, Barbara? Anyway, yeah, exactly. Let's just hear a few words from you, and then there's still some more questions, so we'll go back to the other questions. So over to you, Barbara.
Well, thanks a lot. It's just getting old. And still knowing this is the first time, congratulations to everybody, and thanks to Rural Water Supply Network, that the water sector is really communicating in a dialogue with the productive water use, water rights people, which is, I think, is fantastic, and I'm delighted to see many questions. I have some good news. It is terribly complex, but communities, they can make a map of this in a few hours. It's really our silos and our specialisms. We are looking for markets, we are looking for hygiene that really has, I think, yeah, has been not good for this dialogue or silos, because in a community, they know, very simple, it's the same water resource. And then I talk about the resources given by nature for free, to be shared by all. So the precipitation, the runoff, the streams, the lakes, which then trickles down into groundwater in very, very different ways, but the naturally given water resources. That's one. And when we talk about water tenure, we talk about mainly, in any case, also about those water resources that flow into the infrastructure. And that becomes a completely different governance system because then you have to work hard, women are excluded, there's a male, etc. You have to invest in the construction, operation and maintenance of the infrastructure. And you can do that either individually, and then we get the self-supply as at last webinars a week ago, the self-supply, and also I see the people already saying, well, it's the same infrastructure. We can drill for irrigation, we can drill for domestic uses, and the infrastructure couldn't care less. In the experience, it is a siting of the infrastructure where we see, hey, is it multiple use or not? And it's certainly around homesteads, the chance is very big that people use it for domestic uses and for the livestock, for the chickens, for the livestock, and for small scale homestead-based cultivation. But if the infrastructure is far, far, far away, it is really a farmer-led borehole. It's mainly only for irrigation. And then there are also many other sites of use. And then also the pastoralists, for example, the cattle dams in the pastures, maybe they are mainly used for cattle. But generally the infrastructure, which is a lot of effort, is multiple use around homesteads. And there you see, well, I have done all the effort. Then I think the water that was stored in the infrastructure that is conveyed is a little bit for me than for you. This is not exclusive. We see in rural communities, people still share, certainly for domestic use, and certainly if it's only once in a time emergency. And then lastly, the people are also the same. And the people in the low-income rural areas where we talk about, they have their own community. Hans Kommerketsch found so clearly, if that person is not going to take water, that person remains poor, and that is a bigger problem for us as a community than if that, and then if we just share even the water from the infrastructure. And then water is life. In rural areas, it's not, we are in our sectors only thinking about domestic use, only irrigation, only livestock. But for people, this is one pathway to get life, domestic drinking. It should be clean. And sometimes, as Hela, as you mentioned, I also found that people can separate certain sources only for domestic use because it's clean. Otherwise, we need to treat it. And last week, again, there are ways to just clean up the 3 liters per person per day that you need through point of use treatment. And that, of course, drinking needs to be clean. The domestic use is scrubbing floors. Laundry doesn't need to have drinking water quality anyhow to bring life. But the livestock also brings life, meat, eggs, milk, etc. And the plants that we are growing also brings nutritious food. Or we can sell it and then it brings income. So there are many ways really for people who depend in many ways on water to get life. So let us distinguish a little bit the different governance systems, etc. But let's just ask, as Hela, as you also mentioned, let us start from the design phase onwards, which communities have been doing and what their priorities are, and include the women and prioritize domestic uses for everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Barbara, for your bringing these ideas together and your enthusiasm for this really important topic and for bringing us together for this webinar. There's lots of questions. And there are also quite a lot of people on this webinar who have background with drilling, who are involved in drilling private sector, and also concerns around sustainability. So I'd like to ask a question to all of the panelists, maybe starting with you, Sophia, and kind of going in order. It's a kind of combined hybrid question of a number of things that have come in from Magdalene, from Henk, and from others. And sustainability is a really big issue with respect to water projects, and any advice on improving the sustainability of water projects. And linked to that are also, there have been some concerns about drilling depleting groundwater happening in parts of India. Do you see this as a concern, and is this something that you're thinking about or come across in the different ways that you're working? So you're all working in different ways. So yeah, sustainability question, groundwater depletion question, from all the different kind of perspectives you're coming from, whether the dialogues or the very local or the in-between. So I'll start with you, Sophia. Yeah, looking to learn from you.
All right. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for the questions. To be really honest, and again, I'm gonna talk more, come more from the land sector. So the lessons learned, we have a lot of lessons learned, I think, from the land sector also. For sustainability, and now we're seeing these, I'm working for water tenure for the past 3 years now. We've seen that sustainability do need for a private, consultation, prior and informed consent. These for infrastructures, but also for understanding how people and for really qualitative data from the ground. Because usually what it happens is that the policymakers are completely disconnected with the local practices. And this means that sometimes, not most of the time, but a lot of times, the infrastructures that the government thinks are the right ones are not exactly the ones that people need or are going to use, which is even worse. We see also in this IL some water points constructed for pastoralist communities in the areas where pastoral communities never pass. So this is a complete misunderstanding of the local practices. So for sustainability, I will say there is a need first to conduct qualitative research in the ground to see how the perceptions also around security of water there is in the ground, because also as we've seen with the last research and the work done in the pilot countries in Senegal, in Rwanda, and Sri Lanka, there's a lot of customary tenure arrangements that provide more perceived security to the users than actual legal arrangements. And this is also that needs to be scaling up, and we need to make efforts to build bridges to how to put this knowledge into the tables of the policymakers and the infrastructure investors as well. And I will have to say the same for the drawing of water, because for the rolling of water, from our experience, something that is really important is also to try to have an integrative approach of water resources, that it means water accounting and water tenure. Because we have learned, for example, we have less data, of course, of groundwater, but to give you an example of water accounting exercise in Sri Lanka, all the water accounting exercise, we can see different differences between years that only for an accounting matter we were not able to predict or explain. And when we mix that with the water tenure assessment, then we now we know why people is doing what they are doing. Because sometimes the drilling of water, the decision of pumping on drilling water does not come from a water specific decision. Sometimes it comes from because another livelihood is not available, because of migration, because of a lot of other issues that do need, again, specific qualitative data of what is going on in the ground. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks a lot. That's for such a detailed answer. It's fantastic and got us thinking about other aspects. We have 10 minutes left until we close the webinar. So let's kind of continue on this really important topic with a few points from all of you. Short. So Hella, over to you next. Oh, your microphone's unmuted. If you could just press the unmute button and we can hear you.
Yeah, so yeah, about the sustainability in this case, I'm working on rural communities. I think it's very important to stop putting it on the rural communities, because it's not their responsibility to ensure sustainable access to water. It needs to be shared, but the big part needs to be on the state. They need this support, technical and regular support, and not only giving the water systems and then to manage it on their own. So the customary tenure, the relation, the aid network is very important, but not in the daily life. So maybe in a drought context, in a shock or stress moment, they can rely on this aid network. But for consuming water in their daily life, I think it's not their sustainability, their responsibility. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot. And just as we're going to go around the panel, what I kind of feel that this webinar is kind of bursting at the seams. You know, we have so many things to discuss in more depth, and we did call this Customary Water Tenure 1. So for our participants, if you'd like to have more of this Customary Water Tenure 2, 3, 4, please write in the chat box what you'd be interested in. You know, tell us what topics you want to know more of. You know, some things we're hearing for the first time. I'm not an expert on legal, for example. So let's hear from you. Do you want Customary Water Tenure 2 more? And what would you like? And maybe Aline, you can help us by writing that in the chat box. And without further ado, let's hear your response to the same question to Fadzwa. And your microphone's also muted. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, so with regards to the matter of sustainability, I think people always mention the example from India and what resulted there in terms of, you know, when there were subsidies to solar and, you know, people could pump and there was over abstraction. I think it's an important lesson in terms of what I was talking to earlier around the issue of multiple scales and the issue of water, energy, food nexus or nexus thinking and the understanding of trade-offs, so that when we design interventions, we are not just thinking from one particular perspective of, say, you know, increasing access to water is going to improve agriculture, farmers are going to grow more, they're going to diversify and make money. That is very linear in thinking, and it lacks consideration for other sectors. Equally, if we say solar-based irrigation is going to reduce the costs of pumping water and farmers are going to be able to irrigate, if there's no cost associated to pumping water, there's no incentive for proper irrigation scheduling. So, you know, I'll switch on the pump in the morning, go to town, do my shopping, leave it on, come back in the afternoon, and then switch it off, or I might forget and sleep over and, you know, deal with it the next day. So how do we then also disincentivize that? And what incentives do we need to put in place? So that's where the issue of bundling comes into place, that we need to balance considerations, we need to train farmers, and we need to think at different scales. What are the implications of getting 200 smallholder farmers in one village, or irrigating, or tapping into the same aquifer and growing high value crops with high water requirement? What does it mean for sustainability? And, you know, there are also other options in terms of conjunctive use of ground and surface water resources. Are there surface water resources that we can tap into, and how do we combine all of these things? So it calls for conversations with multiple role players, different sectors beyond water, and, you know, having many different skill sets coming to the space to really address the question of sustainability. Thank you.
Now I'm the one muted. Thank you so much, Tabato. Jessica, you have a minute and a half, and then we'll go to Barbara.
Okay, thank you. It's hard to be one of the last ones because I've gotten all the good answers so far. I have to go back to what I think really honestly the basis for sustainability is more meaningful and thoughtful and inclusive participation, whether that's, I've seen, actually, I was delighted to see someone say, another webinar on free, prior, and informed consent, because I think, the theory around FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, is, that these rights are, again, they're legitimate. Customary rights are legitimate, and that they should not be, taken away or even threatened by third parties, including the government, unless communities have been fully informed, have had a chance to participate in decision making, and have a right of access to justice if their rights are compromised. And while these are often given lip service in national laws, they're usually pro forma, they're pretty sparse, and they aren't often implemented in a meaningful way. Particularly for women or for disabled people or other people who are also have even greater challenges in terms of participating in these processes. So while we've heard it over and over again for, however many decades, we're still not doing it right. And if we really want to see sustainability, the work that we've done here on MUS, the multiple use services here in Zimbabwe, it was so apparent that that was where things fell apart. Where the infrastructure wasn't chosen appropriately, where women were not able to, put in their preferences for how far from the homestead, infrastructure would be located, all of these things. So I think from a sustainability standpoint, that's, improving inclusive participation from the level of the local institutions on up, also participation in other kinds of decision making. When it comes to the data question, I mean, I live and work in Zimbabwe. It's a very, let's say, governance and resource constrained environment. So I think maybe in addition to thinking about the ability of the state, which Hella brought up, which I think is absolutely true, in practical terms, in some places, we need to also turn to the community and say, what data can you be collecting? And how do we then use that data as part of decision-making in a practical and real manner, so that we're not just going in blind with donors coming in and drilling, that kind of situation. Anyway, you said a minute. I'm sorry, it was probably over a minute. I will stop now.
We just have great, informed participants, stakeholders, presenters here. So thanks. Don't worry, there's so much to be talked about, and we've tried to compress a lot into one webinar. Barbara, you have 30 seconds now, so you can have 3 things to say.
Decolonize the water legislation. Really look at the origins of the permit systems, which works for a tiny number of high impact users, to regulate them. But that means it's not an entitlement, which it was in the colonial times. Only settlers could get permits, Latin America and Africa. So make it a regulatory tool, also for foreign investors. Their investment contracts can now take all the groundwater and surface water that they want. It's horrible. And then find prioritization of all the water uses, the natural resource, the uses that contribute to life. Not money, life.
Life. No, thank you very much. And I think that is the perfect point at which to close the webinar. I'm not going to provide any more closing words. We've had a lot of closing words. Just like to thank our team behind the scenes, Melissa, Daniela, and Aline, who've done incredible work to make this happen. Our fabulous panelists, discussants, and chief organizer. And a huge thanks to all of those attending the webinar today. And I can see I didn't even dare to look, because the chat box kept moving. So you've given a lot of ideas for what could be next in customary water tenure. And with that, without any further ado, let me just close this webinar and close the early 2023 RWSN webinar series. And I look forward to interacting with you all more for the next series. Thank you very, very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Wow.